Hello, everyone. I'm Taylor-Kamara, and today I'll be examining an aspect of the healthcare system in what I believe continues to be social injustice. Specifically, I'll be looking at the racial and ethnic gaps that exist within the healthcare system and the effects of injustices seen through the Tuskegee syphilis study. Just a quick overview, I'll discuss some of the core issues, point out some advantages and disadvantages of the industry. We'll talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study as it relates to diversity and justice. Also, I'll cover some of the dominant and subordinate groups involved, the resources at stake, and the social justice champions who made the effort to address the issue. Finally, I'll wrap up by pointing out some of the gaps, that is, effects on race relations, and we'll do a recap of what we've covered. If you've been plugged into the broader discussion over the last decade, healthcare has been a prominent issue on both sides of the aisle. Prior to this debate, what was the healthcare system in the US like? For lack of a better term, pre Obamacare, millions of Americans lacked adequate health coverage. This notwithstanding implementation of the Medicare and Medicaid Acts back in 1965. So, for decades, millions have resorted to buying private coverage or taking a risk of no coverage at all. It is well documented the cost of insurance was outpacing the rate at which the average household income increased, and that was making it more difficult to choose the type of coverage you might need. To be honest, healthcare is not about politics, nor the circus that surrounds it. It's about real people and their lives. Access to care. Because of our deep divisions about government run healthcare, the United States remains one of the few developed nations without single payer insurance system. So many Americans do not have full coverage. Ironically, Americans have access to some of the best medical facilities, practitioners, and technology in the world, but they lack the ability to fully utilize them. Those living below the poverty line are largely uninsured. Also, a wide variation exists in terms of healthcare coverage based on states alone. For example, Massachusetts, they created a healthcare exchange back in '06 that provided more coverage for its citizens when compared to other states such as Texas. Regardless of what your social lens or what social lenses you view this issue, healthcare coverage is a need, whether or not it is provided by the government or not. At some point in our lifetime, we'll have a medical condition that requires some form of medical advice. This need is no different than that of education, public safety, or, to be honest, military defense, all which comes with a hefty price tag. Speaking of price tag, health insurance is very expensive, which makes getting sick more expensive because it can be a financial burden. Poor Americans will forego medical care in order to avoid financial hardship or bankruptcy. So, does the government have a role to protect the general public? Some will argue for and against, depending on your definition of social justice. Just mostly any dictionary will define social justice as a distribution of wealth, opportunity, and privileges within a society. Michael Novak from the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative organization, he defines it as the capacity to organize with others to accomplish ends that benefits the whole community. A common theme here is something has to be done that serves the common interest or common good of the general public. So who decides what common good is and who is responsible? From my point of view, it should be the government simply because the government is the system we use to govern our country, states, and even our communities. It is the mechanism by which we determine policies and enforce them. This shouldn't be that much different, as stated earlier, when compared to making decisions to provide public education at the high school or even collegiate level. In addition, The government must lead the effort in supporting and sponsoring medical research and breakthroughs for the good of the general public. In that regard, the U.S. government has been a world leader in medical research, um, accounting for over 51% of the world's medical research in 2007. But investment in this area has seen a significant drop in recent years because of sequestration and some budgetary constraints. As we research for new cures, one would think ethics must take precedence over medical advances. But this was not the case back in the 1930s when a government agency decided to study black male farmers in Alabama. The Tuskegee syphilis study is well documented, but for those who've never heard of it, you may wonder about the reasons for conducting the studies, and also why a specific group of people were chosen, and obviously the outcome and effect of the study. So, why was the study conducted? In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Services initiated an experiment in Alabama to determine the natural causes of untreated syphilis in African American males. The test subjects were 399 black men with syphilis and 201 uninfected black men who served as the controls. Most importantly, why were these men chosen? Social social Darwinism, social Darwinism. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is a term coined in the 19th century describing the idea that humans, like animals and plants, compete in a struggle for existence, in which natural selection resulted in the survival of the fittest. This essentially provided the basis and rationale for racism within the medical career field because blacks were seen as primitive and could not assimilate into society or, frankly, white communities. Additionally, blacks were deemed prone to diseases. This racist ideology supported the notion that a clinical course of syphilis that was different for the two races, that is, black and white. This approach was viable and obviously benefited on the fact that these people were poor sharecroppers who were historically oppressed. They were direct descendants of slaves. So, what went wrong? A number of things went wrong. Um, the norms at that time allowed for racial and economic profiling. In addition, these individuals did not consent to the study because they were lied to. They were misinformed and told they had bad blood, a term generally used to categorize various ailments, including syphilis. The reality was there was no intention of treating these men for syphilis, even though treatment options were available. The real intention was to observe the effects of the disease if left untreated, and this went on for 40 years and ended 25 years after the cure was widely known and publicly available. As a result, many died painful deaths. Others were blind, and several children, unborn children, were, infected through birth. So, regardless of the circumstances surrounding the state of race during that period, this deliberate lack of ethical consideration shown by the scientists was appalling. These men were mostly poor, illiterate, and misled through false advertising. They gave no indications of informed consent, nor were they aware of the dangers associated with the disease or treatment. In the name of science, they were denied treatment in order for scientists to observe an individual effect of the disease as it progressed all the way through fatality. The study of untreated syphilis in poor black male farmers in Alabama was ethically unjustified, but still executed using unethical methods that produced no new information about the disease. Decades later, the Department of Health finally acknowledged the unethical ways this experiment was conducted. Subsequently, this led to apologies from the president and, after a civil suit, some financial settlement for those men and their families. So, some of the advantages and disadvantages from these issues. One, new ethical standards were in biomedical research were introduced. Congress also enacted the National Research Act into law. This created a national commission for the protection of human subjects of biomedical research to ensure basic research principles were followed. Furthermore, regulations were passed in 1974 that required researchers involved in human experimentation, especially involving minority populations, to get voluntary informed consent from anyone taking part in the studies. As far as the disadvantages, there were just too many, but I'm going to mention a few. The disease was never treated, even though cures were available. Um, Also, this caused loss of life and endangered the lives of unborn children, many who were born with congenital syphilis. Many of these children are exposed to the risk of deformities, severe anemia, brain and nerve issues. But most importantly, it worsened the fears of African Americans going to see the doctors. Many African Americans became skeptical of the medical community, contributing to the belief that the U.S. government manufactured AIDS and, uh, and, and infected their communities. So, um, so how do you connect the dots here? Every human should be of equal value. This is a core human rights principle. But again, this was not the case in the study. Certain exclusions still exist, such as the inability for immigrants groups, such as Latinos, whether they're legal or illegal, to access healthcare because of their legal status or just because of who they are perceived to be. Good health has a particular value for individuals because it is essential to their well being and the ability to fully participate in the labor force. Health disparities is not a generic reference to all health differences or even to all health differences in terms of race. These are specific subset of health differences of particular relevance to social justice because they may arise from intentional or unintentional discrimination or marginalization. In this case, they reinforce the social disadvantage of African Americans. It also proves there were and possibly still evidence that physicians hold stereotypes based on patient characteristics, such as your race, your ethnicity, or even your social class. And this may influence their interpretation of a patient's behavior or symptoms and subsequently their clinical decisions. The dominant and subdominant groups involved within the study were the scientists, the researchers, and obviously the men that were involved. The study during the first year was led by Dr. Clark, but several scientists were involved over the years. Uh, these men were all complacent in their actions and endangered the lives of many of those included in the study, even their unborn children. Because the study's length and the way treatment options evolved over the years, it was hard to pinpoint the blame on one specific individual. The U.S. Department of Health sanctioned these studies and controlled the overall outcome. And also, they allowed the study to continue even though a cure had been found and that was totally effective against syphilis. But regardless of the availability of this cure, health officials did not use the drug, and their failure is just beyond belief. Their actions subsequently led to fuel the mistrust that exists between African Americans and physicians because this was clearly institutionalized racism. African Americans and even poor Americans have differential access to healthcare and other services that continues to contribute to the communication disparities between African Americans and their physicians. Peter Buxton, hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and Jen Heller exposed the study, and they were able to tell the world what was happening at that time. Peter was an employee of the Public Health Service, and during the course of his employment, learned about the experiment from other coworkers. Several accounts state that Peter wrote reports comparing Nazi experiments to the abuse these men had to endure. He filed several protests on ethical grounds, and all were denied. And to be frank, they were swept under the rug. So, as a last resort, he leaked information to Gene Heller, a reporter at that time, who then broke the story. Evidently, their actions led to new regulations that govern biomedical research and ethics. Fred Gray, a civil rights attorney, filed a lawsuit and was able to achieve a successful settlement for $10 million, in addition to medical treatment for those involved and those, at that time those that were still alive. So, the men of Tuskegee were treated not as human deserving of respect and dignity, but as a means to an end, and the government was silent on the subject for decades. It is part of the collective memory of many African Americans, and it continues to fuel suspicion and fear towards medical and public health research and even treatment. Fear of genocide may seem over the top, but there's a long history of abuse of African Americans leading up to the revelation of this study, and more recently, the perception of AIDS within the African American community. Even before AIDS, similar allegations were made by some in the community during the sickle cell anemia screening programs and birth control programs in the 1970s. So the effect of this study lingers on, and it continues to demonstrate the racial and wealth inequalities when it comes to access to medical care and technologies. It begs a burning question about the role of racism and wealth in medical decisions. Following a successful lawsuit, President Clinton in '97 formally apologized to the victims and their families. The government wrongfully violated constitutional rights of those who took part in this study. It was racially motivated, and obviously was discrimination against African Americans because no whites were selected as part of the study. However, we need to look beyond the study because the state of the U.S. healthcare system continues to favor those who can afford it. Uh, there's a long history of disparity when it comes to the distribution and quality of healthcare among Americans. That debate continues, but the real issue is justice. By nature, health and healthcare disparity reflects injustices in our society, and those injustices can and should be resolved. So today we covered some of the core issues of race and healthcare. I did point out some pros and cons. We examined the Tuskegee syphilis study as it relates to diversity and justice. Also, we covered all the major players involved and those who championed the effort to address this issue. Finally, we looked at the effect of the study on race relations and the continued disparity that exists in the U.S. healthcare system. Thank you for your time, and I have all the references on on the slide. Thank you.